This is episode 47 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Richard Dutton, author of Shakespeare's Theatre, A History, and Professor Emeritus at Ohio State University. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my new friend, Cassidy Cash.
The ballads were basically printed on one side of a single folio or half folio sheet. That was known as the broadside, hence the word broadside ballads. They were sold in the streets, market fairs and so on to passers-by or anyone sort of happened to be out shopping or whatever, sold by this army, if you like, of rough singing peddlers.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Many times when Shakespeare would perform a play, there would be a bawdy and comical song and dance show performed after the play. Even if the performance was a tragedy or something more serious, a traditional part of Elizabethan theater included wrapping things up with a jig. Now, the jig was not only an expected part of playhouse performances, but they represented a slice of culture from Shakespeare's lifetime. Many of the song and dance routines performed were inspired by or examples of Elizabethan pop culture. The tunes were a kind of street music, and the stories represented popular tales that would influence playwrights like William Shakespeare. Here to share with us the history of broadside ballads and the Elizabethan jig is our distinguished guest, Lucie Skeaping. Lucie is a British singer, instrumentalist, broadcaster, and writer. She was a founder of the early music group The City Waits and the pioneering klezmer band, The Burning Bush. She presents BBC Radio 3's Early Music Show, a weekly program dedicated to the early music repertoire. She is co-author with Dr. Roger Clegg of Singing Simpkin and Other Bawdy Jigs, musical comedy on the Shakespearean stage, an edition of 9 dramatic jigs from the Tudor and Stuart period, many reunited with their original music for the first time in 400 years. Her other books are Broadside Ballads, winner of the Music Industry Association Award for the Best Classical Music Book of 2006. She has contributed articles for the BBC Music Magazine, Early Music Today, BBC History Magazine, History Today, Financial Times, and others. Lucie is ambassador and a member of the judging panel for Live Music Now and patron of the Finchley Children's Music Group, as well as a member of the Samuel Pepys Club. Lucie, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How were broadside ballads used? What was their purpose? Were they performed during Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, during Shakespeare's time, with the development of printing, of course, the market for broadside ballads was really growing. And of course, it would reach its heyday, if you like, by the last quarter of the 17th century. But they're really amazing because they provide us in the way that history books really so often don't, with this glimpse of popular culture in Shakespeare's time that's really remarkable. I mean, they were the entertainment of their time, almost like magazines or the tabloid press, or the equivalent of, say, Elizabethan TV sitcoms sometimes. So they really reflected society at the same time as they affected it. These ballads were turned out from about the late 1500s in their thousands from the little printing presses around St. Paul's Cathedral. They featured a great range of topics that would, to suit all tastes. They talk about love, religion, morality, and then you get some political comments, which are the ones I find the least interesting, to be honest. They're rather dry. And then you get the ones which always go down well in my concerts and on CDs, which are the comical and the bawdy. But there was a sort of an educational element to ballads as well, because people who had never, say, read Virgil or Ovid could, through a ballad, in its very simplest way, might find out about Dido or the goddesses Diana and, say, Daphne or someone like that through these little rhyming couplets. So that although the main purpose was to entertain, they did educate in some way as well. And then you get the moral ballads that had this sort of religious message. But we also find tabloidy kind of scandal themes, like the description. So there's one very funny ballad, which is a description of an enormous fish that was found on the coast in the north of England, and there's a little picture showing everybody coming to point at it. I suppose it was some kind of beached whale looking back. Or you get like, rather unpleasant ballads about two-headed monsters and Siamese twins, or there's quite a lot about burning some notorious witches as well.
Now, you mentioned that they were a lot like magazines, and in Shakespeare's A Winter's Tale, Mopsa says, "I love a ballad in print." Now, were broadside ballads circulated in print when Shakespeare was writing his plays? Would these have influenced him?
Oh, I think so. I mean, just to explain perhaps a bit more about what they looked like, the ballads were basically printed on one side of a single folio or half folio sheet. That was known as the broadside, hence the word broadside ballads. They were sold in the streets, market fairs and so on to passers-by or anyone sort of happened to be out shopping or whatever, sold by this army, if you like, of rough singing peddlers. And their performances we find from various source material and people who sort of talk about them in the past. Their performances of these peddlers range from, say, simple renditions just alone on their own to something a bit more sophisticated, which might include gestures or mime, variety of voices. Perhaps they might take the different roles, because some of the ballads are in the form of a little dialogue, a sort of lover and a milkmaid or something like that. So they might take the different roles, perhaps even two of them working together. They were bought by people in almost every walk of life. You might find the sort of educated courtiers would buy them, and even the humble labourers. They cost about a halfpenny, which is roughly the price of a loaf of bread in those days. And as you mentioned, these ballad peddlers, such as Autolycus, they might travel far and wide around the country, not just in London, in other words, where the ballads were printed. They'd take a sort of little coach, perhaps from one of the bridges in the city of London, up to the north of England. They might knock on the door of some large country house on the way to sell a copy, probably to the servants, mind you, or they might drop in at a tavern where the customers might enjoy a performance of the latest broadside ballad hot off the press. We do also know, and you can tell this from paintings as well as from source descriptions, that some of these broadsheets were often pasted up on a tavern wall. A lot of the Dutch paintings show this quite clearly, which is really interesting. They're obviously for decoration. They might even be used to sort of remind people of the words of a favourite song if they were having a kind of sing-along evening. But of course, they were also there often to cover up the cracks in the wall. And of course, when a new ballad arrived, again, hot off the press, via the peddler who travelled up to the tavern, say, the old ones would just be covered up or pasted over, or sometimes taken down and used for toilet paper, actually.
Oh my goodness.
So so about the sort of where so much was going on in Shakespeare's time. I mean, Shakespeare references to ballads in, say, As You Like It and Winter's Tale show that he was familiar with them. And of course, his audience would have been familiar as well. I mean, some of these playhouse songs were simply printed later as ballads, as kind of like, come and buy the hit song from the show you've just seen. Although very often we find with the ballads, the lyrics of what we know was in the original play would be altered, or new verses would be added by the anonymous ballad hacks who wrote them, probably just to make people they feel they got their money's worth, and so they fitted the entire sheet of paper. There are even ballad adaptations of actual stories from Shakespeare's plays, like The Taming of the Shrew and Titus Andronicus.
Now, one thing that I did want to ask, because now you're describing some wide circulation of these broadside ballads, but one of the things that I found most interesting about your work in particular is that these broadside ballads were a printing of the words. As I understand it, they didn't include the musical notes, but only had the lyrics. So how do we know what these songs would have sounded like?
Well, yeah, you're right about that. And the broadside ballads themselves very rarely had any musical notation on the page either. In fact, what it says on the top of every ballad, it will have the title, and then it will say underneath in slightly smaller typeface, to the tune of which would be the name of a popular tune that was already in circulation, so everybody would know it before they bought the ballad sheet. So all they had to do was recall the tune in their head and just sort of sing the lyrics to this tune, which they knew, which was really quite easy.
Where were they being sung, though? I mean, is it fair to draw a comparison to pop music today? Was this
very much so? Very much so. These were I often describe these when I'm talking about ballads. I often say these were the pop songs of their day. These were tunes that were in circulation, and sometimes if you see a satire or a kind of funny variety show or a pantomime, people will occasionally. I mean, these days, they might put new or satirical or funny or kind of crazy words to a favorite pop song that we all know by, somebody today. And they used to do very much the same thing. These were dance tunes, tunes that people knew, and they would simply have new words put to them. In fact, there are quite a lot of these favorite tunes would have hundreds of ballads sung to them. So you'd find the same tunes cropping up again and again. But of course, very few of these popular tunes are well known to us today. So when it says, oh, this is to the tune of Gathering Peas Cods or something on the broadsheet, we have to search for that tune. Apart from things like Greensleeves, which arguably most of us would still know nowadays, where do you find these? Now, the point is some of the tunes survive in anthologies of dance music. There's one very famous one called The English Dancing Master, published in 1651, right up into the 18th century, which is a brilliant source for ballad tunes, because so many of the ballad tunes were in fact dance tunes or were preserved as dance tunes. And then other tunes are found again by name in books of instrumental music. You might find a book of lute music or a book of viol music, which will have pieces which are called by some of these old ballad tunes. But of course, it's not always quite so simple as that, because very often the people who printed the ballads often used to rename these tunes by the most recent new ballad that was sung to it. So it needs quite a bit of detective work to work out what they're talking about.
To find what they're...
Yeah. But some of Shakespeare's songs will give us quite a lot. There are quite a lot of clues as to what the tunes would have been. Would have been. They're kind of in the words, and they're found. Although some of the tunes, just a very few of what we feel are the original musical versions of Shakespeare's tunes do exist still by certain named composers.
Now, in Lucie's musical collections, she has a collection of these ballads called Broadside Ballads, and in it she recreates and reconnects the lyrics with the original music, and we'll link to that in today's show notes. But Lucie, I was surprised to discover that these collections are illustrated with what you called, quote, the original woodcuts. Would you explain for those of us that are not familiar with woodcuts what they are and why there would be an illustration to accompany the ballad?
Yeah, well, if you've ever done anything like lino cutting or just done a little bit of the sort of block printing, say if you were doing sort of wallpaper at home with a repetitive print block, this is what they were. They were basically blocks of wood which were hollowed out, so you had carved out, so you have a sort of, as it were, negative of a drawing or of a design. And then they were simply went through the same printing process and printed these wonderful little illustrations at the top of each broadside ballad on the broadsheet. People often call them crude, but I think they've got a brilliant charm all of their own. And of course, you've got to remember that in the days when literacy was by no means universal, having a pretty picture on the top of a ballad sheet, or indeed something which might look a bit sexy or even gruesome, would obviously, just like any of our lower class tabloid newspapers today, would entice people to buy a copy, even if they couldn't actually read the lyrics or understand it. What's interesting is some of the woodcut illustrations, of course, are related to the theme of the ballad. If you get a wooing song, you might have a picture of a gentleman kneeling before a young woman or something like that. But often you get the same woodcut image turning up again and again on different ballads, even when they're completely unconnected to the subject, which I think many people, including me, think this is probably a case for a printer simply choosing to use a popular woodcut, regardless of its suitability, in order to increase sales. This actually can have very amusing effects sometimes, though, because there's one ballad that has been much written about. It's a ballad about welcoming the new princess to England, the future Queen Mary. This is in 1688. The ballad itself, the words, praises her virginity and her purity and her goodness and all the rest of it. But the actual illustration comes from used a lot on many ballads, and it shows a really sort of bosomy woman, complete with those black face patches that obviously associated with whores. So somebody thought, who's going to want to look at a pure...
That's a little cheeky there, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's a bit of the printers being a bit naughty there, and I suppose anyone buying it on that basis would have been sorely disappointed.
Gracious. Well, what has been the most surprising thing that you've discovered about life in 17th century England as you're exploring and researching these ballads?
I suppose the main thing is actually just how much like our ancestors we are today and how little has changed. I mean, some people saw in the ballads a kind of romantic innocence, you can imagine, particularly in the Victorian period. I mean, in fact, even further back, there was a writer called Dorothy Osborne who wrote in the middle of the 17th century how many young wenches keep sheep and cows and sit in the shade singing ballads like some ancient shepherdesses. So that's kind of how they were, the idea of these lovely young rural pastoral girls singing ballads together was lovely. But others called ballads, the dregs of wit, and it was really rude about them. And in fact, one writer, a guy called Henry Chettle, is a playwright around the same time as Shakespeare, he was sort of talking about the ballad peddlers as being idle youths who had nothing better to do than go around selling filthy ballads in the street. They do give us an incredible idea of, people's views and their tastes of the time, because obviously, as we were saying with those little woodcuts and choosing favorite tunes or favorite pictures, this was a very commercial activity. Selling ballads was all about making money, and the hacks who wrote them just churned them out, and the printing presses churned them out, and the peddlers went around selling them. It was pretty rough stuff. Yesterday's fish and chip paper, if you like, they became, so throwaway pulp fiction. So the idea is that really because of that, I believe they really reflected popular tastes in a way that sometimes more reflective, carefully thought out art doesn't always do so. And they give us a sense of society's concern. So you get things like the Armada or the Gunpowder Plot or the Great Fire of London being subjects for ballads. There's a lovely one about the great storm of hail which fell in London and hurt many men and broke many trees. You get, so it's quite sort of local news as well. And then you get news about, quite sort of stories about wives who are cruel to their husbands and cuckold them. So they have the same worries about marriage and all the rest of it, just as we, and of course, there's a lot of ballads about death. There's a really famous one called The Shaking of the Sheets, which compares the dancing around to the ballad tune with the winding of shroud around your body. So it's quite gruesome. So, that's it. They were just like us.
Well, when you're performing these, what were the instruments that would accompany a broadside ballad?
Most ballad peddlers, we think, probably just sang on their own and probably as loudly as possible because they were often in noisy, crowded streets or trying to attract attention. Sometimes we know they would stand on a barrel or something to give themselves a bit of height. Others perhaps carried a sitar, which is a little wire-strung instrument, C-I-T-T-E-R-N, nothing to do with a sitar, as I'm always being asked, which is kind of, I suppose you could call it a sort of Renaissance banjo, if you like. Very light and portable, so you could sling it around your back quite hardy, not like a lute, which is very crushable, but is much, it's a good carrying, rough instrument. And sometimes they might have been joined by a fiddler or even a hurdy-gurdy, perhaps in a tavern or something like that. But I have to say that today, for the purposes of sort of my own CDs or my own concerts and other of my contemporaries, we tend to put together little bands for recordings. So it helps to bring them to life. And there's certainly, that's the way probably in a theatre you would have heard a ballad, with a bit of a little theatre band or something, and they make for a better listen these days. But, fiddles, that kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah. Lucie recreates these broadside ballads as part of her work, and she was kind enough to bring a sample of her work to the studio today. So, Lucie, we're going to listen to two examples from your work that represent broadside ballads from Shakespeare's lifetime. And the first one is an instrumental version of these songs. So set us up what this is we're about to hear.
Yeah, I thought we'd start with an instrumental piece because the broadside ballads were all about being set to popular tunes. So you could argue the tunes were there already, and then the person writing the little ditties, the little ballads, would then, say, oh, I think I'll set this to so-and-so tune. And this particular one we're going to hear was a really favorite tune. It was actually called Green Sleeves and Yellow Lace. It was very popular, almost certainly in circulation during Shakespeare's time, although like all the music really that I perform and work with and that we're going to hear, the earliest sort of sources we have are a bit later. But of course, all this stuff was almost certainly in circulation for a long time. So the earliest reference is John Playford's English Dancing Master Anthology of 1651, but it was around undoubtedly before that. It's called Green Sleeves and Yellow Lace, a really nice tune.
That's beautiful, that tune. And you recognize it. It's similar to what we have now in terms of how it sounds. That's so exciting. So then the writers of the broadside ballads would take a tune like that and add words to it that became kind of a pop song. And this second sample from Lucie's work that we're going to hear is exciting to me because it's called The Merry Wooing of Robin and Joan. And it's one of the ways that we think Shakespeare knew about or had as a part of his culture, the story of Robin Hood that gets mentioned in several of his plays. So, Lucie, explain to us what this second sample is going to be about.
Well, this is, like so many ballads, it's very, very comical. And it's interesting that you refer it to the Robin Hood sort of legend, because, of course, if it was really Robin Hood, it would be Robin and Marian. But this is a kind of comical, satirical takeoff, and it's Robin and Joan because this Robin is no longer, it's not the great handsome man of the forest with his gorgeous maid Marian, but he is Robin, a country bumpkin, a bit of a lout who wants to woo his neighbour Joan, who is equally loutish and a bit rude. And what happens? But he's so country bumpkin. He has no idea how to woo her. Luckily, his mother comes along and tells him what to say to her, tries to help him. And he says, you're here in the song, look, come on, straighten your hat and, but stop picking your nose and go and say to her, good afternoon, Joan. Don't just shout at her. And he goes, oh, thank you, mother. I understand now. And I don't think it's too much of a spoiler alert to tell you that at the end, having been rather rude to him, Joan comes round.
Wonderful. Well, let's have a listen.
Oh, mother, I've been a bachelor this 12 and 20 year, and I've often been a wooing, and yet I'm never there near. Joan grumble, she'll have none of me. I look so like a lout.
These samples are incredible, Lucie. Would these have been songs that Shakespeare would use on stage? Would they bleed over into public performances like that, or would they only be street music?
Oh, no, certainly. I mean, there was much less, I believe, sort of difference between sort of art music or posh music or theatre music and what was out on the streets or pop music. It was really, people heard the same tunes. They didn't have views about things being highfalutin or not, and certainly Shakespeare would have been delighted to use popular tunes in his plays. We're not absolutely certain, except in a few cases, exactly what tunes he used, although there are some surviving, particularly from the Tempest and possibly from As You Like It as well. But basically, he would have used popular tunes, and rightly so, and certainly at the end of plays, if they would have had some dance, or in the middle of plays, or a dance interlude, undoubtedly he would have used a popular song of the day.
Now, Lucie's musical history book called Singing Simpkin and Other Bawdy Jigs came out in 2014, and it directly looks at jigs on the Shakespearean stage. Lucie, please explain to us what the difference is between a jig that we've heard of as being at the end of Shakespeare's plays and the broadside ballad that we've been discussing.
Well, there is a close relationship. In fact, in some cases, they can be the same thing, because a number of broadside ballads are actually called jigs in their title, printed on the broadsheet. Those ballads, the ones that are called jigs, can often be in the form of a dialogue, say between a young man and a young girl, And sometimes the ballad like that will include a narrator's voice, like it will have a line saying, and then he said, or then he did this, he put her arm around her, she said, blah, blah, blah. But often in other jig ballads, we see that in the print, they're almost written out like a mini play with the names of the characters, just like a play script, no sort of narrator. But so we can imagine that would be very, very natural for those ballads, like jigs, that were kind of also ballads, to be sung by 2 or 3 peddlers or 2 or 3 actors, even either in the street or even perhaps in a tavern courtyard, and gradually even onto a stage as a little interlude. So they're kind of gradually, ballads are kind of giving birth to jigs, or jigs are kind of gradually giving birth to ballads. There is an incredible interlocking going on there.
I just think it's amazing what I'm hearing as you're describing these is they really are a great source of knowing what life was like for William Shakespeare and just the very literal move over onto the stage. I mean, it sounds like these jigs were set up to be a kind of skit from the start.
Yeah, I mean, the jigs in my book, Singing Simpkin and Other Bawdy Jigs, I sort of reconstructed, if you like, what I would say the 9 best surviving or the 9 surviving jig texts or scripts. And some of them, unlike most of the ballad jigs, contain 3, 4, or even 5 different characters. And some of those jigs even include stage directions like sort of exit or enter, or she opens a trunk, or they dance, and so on. And those sort of stage directions are what I decided with my co-author Roger Clegg. It's what I decided that how we would define the difference between a jig and a ballad jig, if you like. So a kind of theatre or playhouse jig that would probably have been performed as an afterpiece or an interlude in one of the big plays in say the Globe or somewhere. We decided to just use the ones which had stage directions and quite a few characters. So that was our definition. We just made it up, but I think it's a neat one, really.
Lucie, how do we know what jigs would have looked like on stage for William Shakespeare?
Well, we don't know a lot, unfortunately, as there are so few references. But in fact, we don't know whether the jig actors were even the same people as the actors who just performed in the main play that happened before the jig, came on at the end. And if so, would there have been a little interval perhaps at the end of the play where the actors would disappear and change their costumes, then come back on the stage as the kind of comedians to give the little jig? Or maybe the jig was performed by a totally different group of actors who just turned up at the theatre at the end of the play. There is some evidence, though, as to how the jigs might have looked on stage. And there's a couple of really sort of interesting accounts, which are obviously very, very valuable to people like me. One is written by a German tourist to London who went to see the bear baiting at the pit in Southwark, right by the Globe. And he writes in a letter home, after the bear baiting was over, he writes, a number of men and women came forward from another compartment, dancing, conversing, and fighting with each other. And obviously we ask ourselves, could that have been some form of kind of after show or jig entertainment? And there's another German tourist who writes that he went to see the play Julius Caesar, I think it was the Globe, and after the play he writes that they danced on stage quite elegantly with 2 people dressed as men and 2 people dressed as women. So there obviously is this sense of some kind of entertaining afterpiece. It's really frustrating that we don't know who would have performed it, how long they went on for, but there are some wonderful stories of these jigs being so entertaining at the end of plays that there was a lot of people were very disgruntled, the authorities, because gradually you got a lot of these sort of ill-educated, as it were, people who didn't want to watch the whole play. They used to come along and queue up outside the theatre and bang on the doors and wait till the play was over and then burst in just in time to see the jig, which of course at the same time all the rather po-faced people who didn't want to see the jig because it was far too bawdy would try to be getting out. So there was a great crush at the door of the theatre.
Oh, what a mess. Wow.
So there we are.
Well, Lucie, this is fascinating, and it's been a great introduction into Elizabethan jigs as well as broadside ballads. I know we would love to learn more. What are some of your favorite books or resources that you would recommend we look at to look further into Elizabethan jigs and broadside ballads?
All right. Well, obviously, I hope you won't think me immodest if I recommend recommend my own book, Singing Simpkin and Other Bawdy Jigs. I've co-written it with Roger Clegg, and it's published by University of Exeter Press. And it's a terrific read, actually, she says.
Yes,
modestly.
I've looked at those, and we'll link to that in the show notes for today's episode, because those are excellent resources to start with for sure.
Right. My book about broadside ballads, published by Faber Music, which was published some time earlier, which I have to say won a prize from the Music Industry Awards, which I went to collect it at a big dinner, and it was one of the high spots of my life, I have to say.
Congratulations.
I felt as if I was at the Oscars. I just picked off my shelves a few books which I thought would be nice to recommend, if I may, just 3 or 4. I'll just briefly tell you. So one is The Rise and Fall of Merry England, the Ritual Year, 1400 to 1700. It's the most lovely book, and it's by a chap called Ronald Hutton, a very eminent historian. It's incredibly comprehensive account of the religious and the folk and popular rituals of late medieval, early modern period in England. You know, he talks about plough rituals, May revels, all sort of midsummer celebrations, hobby horses, and the Lord of Misrule. You know, stuff that is really important to understand if you're going to get to Shakespeare plays, in my humble opinion, because there's a lot of allusions to that sort of thing as well. There's this fabulous book called Shakespeare's Songbook by one of your countrymen, Ross W. Duffin. Very, very, very good book. It's called Shakespeare's Songbook. And he had the most brilliant idea of finding the origins of every single musical reference, whether it's a tune, a song, or just something in a script, in Shakespeare's plays, and it's incredibly thorough. And you know, you think you read a speech or something, he prints a part of a speech, and it just seems like an interesting speech about something, and then he says, aha, but if you look at that word there, that little phrase actually is first line of a ballad, and he finds a ballad, and he says that they're actually giving a double meaning, and it's just brilliant. It's the book I wish I'd written myself. It's just fabulous.
Wonderful.
And it includes a CD as well, so yeah, I really do recommend it. Very good commentary as well, and he's a lovely chap. Then there's an interesting one called Children of the Revels, and I'm not sure it's in print. I just got this on Amazon. You know, I'm sure it's somewhere out there. Children of the Revels, the boy companies of Shakespeare's time and their plays, by Michael Shapiro. It discusses the boys' acting companies who performed Shakespeare's plays at the court of Elizabeth and James I, particularly during the midwinter revels. And these boys came from grammar schools, chapel choirs, church institutions, and you know, it tells you kind of what their life was like and how the performances might have been. And it's just amazing when you think how, you know, our kids today, in a million years, could they have done that? Who knows?
Wonderful. We will link to all of these books in today's show notes, because we definitely want to check them out. I'm excited about Children of the Revels, especially. That sounds really interesting. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I am supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, I'm going to actually choose something a little later than Shakespeare, which is the Diaries of Samuel Pepys. Because as well as being a BBC broadcaster of early music and obviously writing and performing and researching ballads and jigs, I am also, wait for it, drum roll, the sort of not chairman, but the kind of illustrious secretary of the Samuel Pepys Club, which is a very ancient society in England, and lots of very dignified academics belong to it and dine every year and talk about Pepys. So I always feel there's more to learn about Pepys, and I want to impress them, so I shall read it again.
Oh, excellent choice for sure. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I have for the last many years now, I've been presenting my radio program, BBC Radio 3. It's a program called The Early Music Show, which is Sunday afternoons at 2 o'clock local time, which covers an incredible range each week for an hour. I chat to people, I play music, I have guests, I pop into concerts, and it's all about music from sort of earliest times, sort of medieval, I guess, or even we can even get back earlier than that.
Wow, what a great thing. Well, we'll definitely check that out.
I have one of those to write every week. In fact, the next one I'm doing is about an Italian singer, funnily enough, not so late after Shakespeare's time, a woman called Barbara Strozzi, Strozzi. And I thought I'd mention her because she's really unusual. I'm doing a little survey of her and her music. Renaissance singer, but she was also a composer and she was a woman, and we know her stuff and it survives, which is absolutely incredibly unusual in this time for a woman, as you can imagine.
Absolutely.
So in fact, some of the documents about her say she was a whore, and you just can only kind of wonder why they say that, because they just can't imagine a woman having any sort of guts at all. I'm exploring, one of the things I've been looking into is a new kind of jig, which there's just not enough about, but I'm dying to reconstruct it. And I don't know if I've got time to tell you, but it's basically a libel jig, which means that the script of this jig, the text, the song text, only survives because it was found in the flyleaf of a libel trial, which took place in the early 1600s, and this jig was presented in evidence because it was so rude, and it obviously libeled some local people because the jig was kind of about them, and it was some professional actors were paid to take it around the locality up in the north of England and perform it in sort of local halls, and so all the people would laugh at the people who were being libeled, and they were so upset they took them to court, and it survives because the clerk of the court wrote the script out as a testimony. So it's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to try and put that together if I can with a friend of mine.
Well, that's very fascinating. Lucie Skeaping, broadcaster, performer, and director of The City Waits. We are delighted to have spoken with you today and have you share with us about Elizabethan jigs and broadside ballads. Thank you for visiting That Shakespeare Life.
It was a pleasure.
To see links to many of the resources Lucie mentioned in today's episode, including a copy of her book Broadside Ballads and the one she wrote on Elizabethan jigs, check out the show notes for today's episode, including linking you over to more resources. We pack a lot of history in there that we simply aren't able to cover in one episode. So to find out more about Elizabethan jigs, Broadside Ballads, and how they influenced the works of William Shakespeare, as well as to learn more about Lucie and her work, please visit the show notes at CassidyCash.com/episode 47. That's CassidyCash.com/EP47. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.